Hi guys, my name's Brad Allen, and today I'm going to be going through some of the exporting options you have with Adobe Premiere CS6, just giving an overview of how to export to different formats, the way that works, and also how Premiere Pro integrates with Adobe Media Encoder if you're wanting to send your encodes out that way. So the majority of our time for this video won't actually be spent looking around in Premiere in this view so much. We'll actually be looking in the Export Media tab. Now, just quickly, when you're needing to actually export things out of Premiere, you've got to make sure you have something selected for it before this is going to be visible. So, for instance, I've got my timeline selected at the moment, but if I had my effects control selected, then when we go to export media, Premiere isn't going to know what we're actually trying to export. So just a quick heads up if you ever get confused by that. So let me go in. Shortcut is supposed to be Control M. And for some reason that has hated me today, but let's go in the manual way, export media, and straight away our little pop-up box comes up and I'll start going through all these options with you. So the first thing I want to go through is our pane over on this side. We have two tabs, one called source and one called output. Now the source window shows you what's actually going into your export settings dialog box, and the output settings window shows you what your export will look like after you've had the settings over here applied to it. So because our the timeline that I'm exporting looks like this, we can see that the source is going to look exactly the same. We can do crops and stuff to it in here if we're needing to, but unless you've got a really bizarre niche reason to be doing that, that's almost never going to be happening. So let me decheck that and come back across to output. Now the other option we have is the way we're scaling our footage within the window. At the moment, because I've got the resolution set to exactly what I've got the resolution set to the same aspect ratio as the footage in here. Scaling to fit and scale to fill and stretch to fill are all going to give me exactly the same options because it's not having to adjust for a different aspect ratio in any way. Let me just quickly show you though. If this was 1920 by 1080, then you'd see instantly on here that we've got black bars up the top and bottom to make it fit with that 1920 by 1080 ratio. However, on the source one, since it's still the source, it's not going to have those black bars, but the output window shows us what we're going to actually end up with after it gets spat out of Premiere. Under source scaling though, if we were to change this to scale to fill, it's going to keep enlarging the image until there are no black bars. It's going to completely fill the frame. And stretch to fill, on the other hand, instead of scaling it in a uniform way, it will just pull the top and pull the sides out until it's filled the frame, even if it distorts the way the actual image looks. For most purposes, scale to fit is going to be the one you're looking for because it means you're not losing any of the picture and it's going to always be keeping it completely in the right, I guess, in a uniform way, so it's not stretching it in a disproportionate manner. So now let's come across to our export settings. The match sequence settings little dialog box here isn't one you're going to be using very often. It might sound extremely handy, but what it actually does is it disables you from using audio and video settings. And what it's actually going to, the sequence settings that it's matching to are the pre-render settings that you would have in your timeline. So if you go to sequence and then sequence settings, then you would see that our video previews and audio sample rate and the way that's working, that is what Premiere will be matching to when you've got that match sequence settings box selected. So for most cases, you're never going to be wanting to doing that because you're going to be exporting out to a particular format for a particular reason, and not basing it on what kind of pre-render settings were for you whilst you were working on the edit. So the first and probably most important setting to get right is the format you're exporting to. Now, for people that are new to exporting whatsoever, this dialog box can be a little confusing. And that's because it not only has formats that you're exporting to, it also has codecs that you're exporting to. So now what I mean by that is whilst AVI is a format that you can export to, it's actually a wrapper that can have multiple different codecs inside. Not multiple codecs within each file you create, but you can have different codecs depending on the file you're creating, even though the file might end in .avi. The same goes for QuickTime movies, which end in .mov. On the other hand, there are formats in here like H.264, which is a codec. Like if you're making a file that's a H.264, it can only be a H.264 because that is the codec. It will actually come out in a .mp4 wrapper, but a H.264 can't have anything inside it other than a H.264. So that's just a matter of learning over time what different codecs are and learning which are different wrappers that can have different codecs inside. For the ones that are codecs, everything's going to be pretty straightforward. So for H.264, for example, you're going to be specifying all the settings for that codec here. On the other hand, if I was working in, say, QuickTime, then I now get an extra dialog box in here to also choose which video codec I'm going to be putting in that QuickTime file. So I can be selecting between H.264, I could be exporting out to Avid DNX HD, DV50PAL. If you're working on Mac, you may also have Apple ProRes options as well. So it's worth keeping that in mind. Now, it's probably also worth mentioning, if you are exporting out to different codecs within something like a wrapper like QuickTime, let's say DNX HD, you also get an extra dialog box called Codec Settings that let you get into some nitty-gritty details of that particular codec that you're working in. But for us, for the moment, let's just keep working through these basic settings. So you've got your format options here. Some will be for audio and video formats, such as H.264. Some will be for audio-only formats, like AAC audio, waveform audio, and I think there's another. Maybe, oh no, AIFF is an audio format also. So if you're needing to export straight out in an audio-only format, and you're not needing to export visuals out, perhaps it's going for a sound mix, or being used as a reference track for some other person in the process. That's how you would do it. So if I was needing a WAV file spat out of my timeline's audio, then I would come into the export dialog settings, select that particular format, make sure everything is selected properly, and export out. You can also export out an image in this kind of way as well. So if we wanted to spit out a JPEG frame, you would come down, and rather than export as a sequence, we would deselect that because we don't want a whole sequence of frames, we just want one particular frame. And when we hit export, it would be exporting out one single JPEG frame of the way that our output settings look like. For the majority of your time, though, you won't be exporting out just single still frames or audio, you'll be exporting out video and audio files. So they're actually useful. And you can send them to DVD, the web, wherever you're going. So let's go through some more settings. The other thing I forgot to mention is in this panel down the bottom here, we should probably have a quick little explanation of what this little bar here means and the way to use it. Essentially, this bar is showing us which parts of our timeline we're actually going to export. So at the moment, you can see that our source range is sequence in and out. We also have these other options here, entire sequence, work area, and custom. So I'll quickly go through all of them. Entire sequence will export out everything that's on the timeline. So if I had other clips up here and here, then even if I had my in and out selection only running up to here, it's going to export out everything up to here anyway. On the other hand, if I had sequence in and out area, when I'm on the timeline, I can specify the in and out area. So I can hit I for in, and I can hit O for out. And now when I go back into those export settings, we'll be able to see that it's adjusted that source range for us to where I place those in and out markers. For people that are used to working in earlier versions of Premiere Pro, the work area bar might be more familiar to you. So for people that are brand new to CS6, you'll find that the in and out settings are pretty much the in and out selections are pretty much the default way for working, and that's more in line with the industry standard way of doing things. But for people coming across with the work area bar, let me just do a quick explanation. So the work area bar, although it's not visible at the moment, in previous versions of CS6, you also had this separate bar here called the work area bar, and it would allow you to mark sections that you wanted to render, whether pre-rendering or doing a final export, independently from where your in and out markers are. I think Adobe realized that it was a kind of redundant control anyway, because your in and out markers could serve as doing that purpose anyway. So that's why using in and out markers has become kind of the default standard these days. But Adobe's left it in for you guys if you've got a purpose or a use for using the work area bar as opposed to in and out markers, then it's still there and you can just enable it through that. So actually, let me just quickly turn it back on and show you. Let's say we only wanted to export this much of the timeline. Now when we go to export media and we have work area bar selected, you'll see that the source range has been adjusted down to here. Now alternatively, apart from marking an area on your timeline when you're editing, you can also do just a custom selection from within the export settings dialog box. So that will let you just drag your in and out handles to any particular section that you need. Usually this isn't going to be as accurate because you can't actually zoom in on the timeline and make sure you've nailed it perfectly. But you still do have timecode markers if you're needing to bounce to a particular point. So for example, if we wanted to jump to 1 minute 30, which is here, then I can set an in point there. And if I was wanting to then jump to, let's say, 2 minutes 40, I could set an out marker that way as well. This little, I guess, text here tells us the duration of the output file. So because we set our in marker at 1:30 and our out point at 2:40, it means our total runtime that's going to be exported is 1 minute and 10 seconds. So that should cover all of that side of the panel. Hopefully that's of some use if you've been stumbling around with some of those things. Now back over to this side, let's suppose you know what format you're going to, because that's going to vary depending on the project that you're working on, where your files are going to, and what purpose they have. So I'm not going to tell you the right format to be exporting because there's no one right answer to that, and that's why there's so many different options to be able to export in. Now what you can do is you can specify presets. So Adobe have kindly built in a whole lot of presets for you, whether it's for exporting out to YouTube or Vimeo or a myriad of other different formats in between. You can select from one of their custom presets if it looks like what you're wanting, and it doesn't lock you into those settings. You can then still go ahead and make extra modifications to the settings down here, but it is often a nice starting place to work from. Alternatively, if you've got your own settings, then you can save them as presets for yourself. So let's say I was exporting out and I wanted to change these settings to 1920. Let me change that frame rate because that doesn't fit within that profile. I want to change these settings to 1920 by 800, which is the resolution of the timeline that I'm working on. And let's say all those other settings are fine for the moment. I can then hit the Save Preset button, and I can name this as my own preset. So let's say Brad's Fave Preset. You also get two other little checkboxes here. If you want to save filter settings, which is any settings set under this tab here, and save FTP settings, which is any settings set under that tab there. Generally, they are not going to be essential to the way a preset works. FTP is just for if you're wanting Premiere to upload to an FTP server after it's finished encoding. And filters is basically if you're just wanting to apply a blur to the whole thing. So generally, it's your video, audio, and multiplexer tabs that are going to be your main considerations. So I pretty much always leave these unchecked when saving a preset. So now you can see under the presets dialog, right up the top, I will have my own custom presets, and I can go ahead and make as many of these as I need. Additionally, I can also import presets if somebody sent me a preset, or if you've saved presets previously on another system, you can bring them across back into Premiere to be able to work with in the future. And of course, if I make a terrible preset, I can always delete it as well. So I'm just going to delete that off for now. You can also add comments in with the presets that you're making if that's of use to you. Now, the output name is just where you specify what the name of the output file is, and also where it's going to be saved. So that can be anywhere on your computer. I'll let you guys work that part out. Let me just give it any kind of name. We've got an export video and export audio checkbox. This is for if you're just wanting to export audio or if you're just wanting to export video. So for example, if I didn't want the audio attached to this export, I could deselect audio and only the video would export, and vice versa. Now the summary tab we've got here, or not tab, just little area we've got here, gives us information on what's coming into the export settings dialog box, which is the source information, and then the output information, which is referring to all the settings that we've got set down here. So we can see in here that the source footage coming in is 1920 by 800 with a 1.0 pixel aspect ratio. It's at 24 frames a second. It's progressive scan. That's its duration. It's at 48 kilohertz, and it's in stereo as well. And we can see the export settings it's going out to as well. Now let's go through some of these settings under the video tab, because this is where I find myself doing the majority of the tweaks and adjustments for the presets that I'm making and working on. So the first thing we have that's pretty much identical for all formats that you're working on is the resolution that you're going out to. So under H.264, which resolutions are allowed can change depending on the level that you're actually working at. It isn't that complicated for other formats, but for H.264 in particular, it has come up with different profiles, well not profiles, levels over time, which allow different resolutions and different frame rates and stuff like that. Generally, the higher level you're going to, the bigger resolutions are allowed, but the smaller the compatibility of the file with devices. So if you've ever got any queries about that, it's probably worth doing an internet search on what device you're exporting out to, or perhaps it might be worth just jumping to a preset if you know which device is in mind, because Adobe's already looked up that information and you can be sure that you're going to be exporting out to the right level straight away. So let me jump back up. Video resolution is a pretty standard setting. Most people would know how to use that. In my case, I was going out to, what was I doing? I was doing 1920 by 800, but let me just go to the standard 16 by 9 size. That's giving me an error because the frame rate is way too high for that resolution at that level. This should be 24. So 1920 by 1080 is default Full HD 16:9. Now what we can also do is we can add a what's that even called? I guess it's a link, but what it means is that Premiere will hold the right aspect ratio for you even when you change the size of these dimensions. So for example, if I was wanting to render this out at half the frame size, then 1920 divided by 2 is 960. So if I punch in 960, it's going to automatically scale the height down for me so that the same aspect ratio of the entire frame is maintained, which is very nice of Premiere to do for us, I guess, but oftentimes it can get in the way, so if that ever does, just uncheck that little link. Frame rate is the frame rate. You'll pretty much always want to be having this the exact same frame rate as the source footage that's coming into your export settings. The reason is if you're exporting out to a different frame rate, you're going to have dropped frames or doubled up frames if it's higher or lower than the export frame rate. You would only export out this way to a lower frame rate if you really had a need to save on space or something, or you're trying to go for a bizarre kind of look. But for 99% of cases, you'll always want to be making sure this is matched up with the source footage that's coming into your export. Now the field order is blanked out at the moment because it's progressive for me, and for a lot of people these days, basically everything shoots progressive unless you're working in TV land. If you're working in TV land, then you'll also have interlaced footage that has different fields. I'm not going to go into that and explain it in this, but it's worth looking up if that is something that you're interested in. It's if you're working if you're listening to this tutorial and you have no idea what interlaced footage is, then you'll probably be wanting to stick to progressive anyway, because it means you're probably going to just be exporting out for web stuff. If you do know what interlaced footage is, then I probably don't actually need to explain the field order and stuff, because you'll know what to do and go ahead with that. But either way, this is where you specify the field order and whether it needs to be progressive or interlaced. Now, the aspect isn't referring to the aspect of the whole frame size, but rather the aspect ratio of the individual pixels themselves. Now, if you're exporting out for web or cinema, or almost all HD formats, this is pretty much always going to be square pixels. If you're exporting out to standard def files, or for TV or for DVD, this will often be at a non-square pixel aspect ratio. Adobe's kindly built in the various formats for you, so you can just go ahead and select it. For example, if you're working in Powerland and you're going out to a 16:9 DVD, then your pixel aspect ratio is going to be 1.4587. Conversely, if you're working in NTSC land, depending on whether you're needing widescreen format or just normal 4:3, that will let you select between those two. But again, square pixels are getting used more and more these days, both for digital projection and pretty everything on the web basically will always be square pixels, because that's the way that computer screens work. Similarly, for any devices like iPhones, iPods, whatever, you'll always be square pixels on them. So the next is for TV standard. This is only really relevant these days if you're actually making something that's going to end up on the TV. So if you are creating something that's going to end up on a DVD or go out to broadcast, if you're in the US or Japan, NTSC is going to be a format to aim for, and in Asia, Europe or Australia, New Zealand, those territories, PAL is going to be the format that you're exporting to. Now, I won't go over the profile and level too much because I've already mentioned the level slightly, but they're just a little bit above what this tutorial is about, and they'll probably get a little bit too complex. But you can always look that information up online if it does interest you. Now, the render at maximum depth checkbox is for telling Premiere to render at the highest bitrate possible, both when it's interpreting footage and also when it's applying effects as well. So if you're wanting Premiere to actually utilize 32-bit processing when it's applying effects that can do 32-bit processing, enable render at maximum bit depth, because that's going to really enable Premiere to work with the maximum bit depth it can. Now, bitrate settings, I'll just do a quick explanation of this. Constant bitrate and variable bitrate. Constant bitrate basically gives you one setting, so it just tells it, let's say we're going for 10 megabit a second. It's just going to pump 10 meg. It's just going to allow the video to have 10 megabit a second constantly for the entire duration of the piece. On the other hand, a variable bitrate will give it a target bitrate, but it will let it fluctuate up and down over that or under that target bitrate, depending on whether the detail in the scene actually needs that extra information. So you'll be able to set your target bitrate, then you can also set the maximum bitrate it's allowed to go over that when it's needing to allow for some extra information and detail. So that's a simple matter of setting those. Again, the bitrate that is allowed can also be affected by the level that you are encoding at. Keyframe distance, I'm not going to explain this either, as that's a little bit complicated too, but generally I find leaving that at the default settings gives pretty good results in Premiere. Now, if we have a look at these other tabs, I'll quickly go through filters. The only filter under here is Gaussian blur. I'm not sure why you would ever need to use this. It just applies a blur over the whole image that you're exporting. Again, I have no idea why this is even an option, but I'm sure it has some purpose somewhere. On the other hand, audio settings are very important. They will vary depending on the format that you're actually exporting out to. So at the moment, because I'm exporting at H.264, you can see my only choices for audio format is AAC, and I can do a couple of different versions of that. But if I was, say, exporting out to a QuickTime file, then you can see that I've actually got multiple different audio codecs I can be exporting out to. But let me just jump back. Where are we on? H.264. Now you can select your sample rate, you can tell it how many channels it's allowed to have. Again, these are things you'll usually want to be matching up with the timeline you're actually working in. There wouldn't be many reasons you would do that. Perhaps if you're working in a 5.1 audio mix and you needed to bounce it out to stereo, if it was just for client approval or something similar to that, you might bounce it down to stereo. But even then, you would probably normally have a dedicated stereo mix or something separately on a different timeline. But that aside, audio quality doesn't actually affect the size, but is more the amount of processing that's given to the audio quality. The bitrate settings are what affect the size of the resulting audio file that's attached to the video file. So that lets you select the bitrate of that. Advanced settings, won't worry about that either because we're not really needing to worry about that in this. Multiplexing refers to whether a file and audio, the visual and audio file are merged together in one. It is possible to do an export where the audio and video portions of that file come out as two separate files. So for example, if I was exporting out a DVD and I go to multiplexing, if I've got none selected on here, then I will get two separate I'll get two separate files. The first is an M2V, and depending on the audio format I've selected for the audio, I will get a separate audio file come out. So what I mean, for example, is if it's PCM, then it'll probably be a .wav that comes out. If it's a Dolby Digital, then it'll probably be an AC3 or something like that that comes out. Back to H.264, the only other settings in here are FTP. So this is if you're wanting Premiere to automatically upload the resulting export to a server of yours. So if you were wanting to, you just check that checkbox, punch in all the names and the relevant login details, and then it would export at the end. Always make sure to give a test to the settings that you do beforehand. That way Premiere can make sure that it's actually connecting to your FTP properly before you start the encoding process. I find myself not using that very often, but it is handy for those times that you've got a really long export and you'll be away from the system, but you need it to automatically put it up on an FTP server for you. Now, the other important settings we've still got to go through are these three here. Use maximum render quality refers to how well Premiere scales footage up and down. So what I mean by that is that if we were exporting out to that 960 figure we had before, so 960 by 540, Premiere, because it's got this 1920 by 800 footage coming in, it's got to squish it down to that 960 by 540 dimension when it's exporting it out. And if I don't have use maximum render quality selected, it will still do that, but the results won't be as nice. And the reason for that is because it uses more complex algorithms when this box is selected that take extra processing time, and in some cases it can go back to higher resolution original source footage that Premiere is originally drawing from. And so using that original higher res footage to downscale from can add extra time to that export. In particular for guys that are working with red footage, if you're exporting out, then deselecting use maximum render quality will have a dramatic effect on how little amount of time it takes to export. And that's because rather than Premiere going into the original red file at its full resolution and then downscaling it, so for example from a 4K file all the way down to our final resultant 960 by 540, it's instead grabbing it at the timelines. Actually, no, it's not even that. It would just be debayering the original footage at 960 by 540. And so it doesn't need to do an extra downscaling algorithm out of that because it just pulls that resolution out of the file straight as that. Now that's not really the best way to do it, but if you're not using maximum render quality, it will dramatically improve your export times. So keep that in mind, especially for red guys, because it makes a massive difference. Now, the other thing that also makes a massive difference is if you have a GPU installed that's supported by Premiere. Because scaling is something that can be really easily offloaded to a GPU, having a GPU installed can make the penalty of using maximum render quality significantly reduced, because instead of it all being handled by the CPU in your system, it can be passed off to the GPU to be encoded at the same time while the CPU is still chugging away. And the GPU does a really good job at it as well. So don't think that you're getting a lesser result by passing it off to the GPU. It'll actually do just as good a job, if not better, quality-wise, and with time benefits as well. Now, the Use Previews button is for if you've got pre-rendered footage within Premiere Pro. It basically tells Premiere to use those existing previews that you might have already pre-rendered in your timeline. So, for example, if let me just get rid of that work area bar. If I needed for some reason to render this area of footage here, then when I go to render into out area, it will pop up and start rendering out that area between there. Let me just drag these handles back a bit so it's not going to take quite so long. Render into out. So that's better. So once that renders out, you'll see that we get a little green bar which indicates that it doesn't need rendering and it's going to play back in real time. And then when we're in our export dialog box, using previews, we'll render all of this red stuff still, but it means rather than having to render this green area again, it's going to just pull that preview that it's already rendered and then just render that pre-rendered file. So if you've held on to what I've just said, from a quality standpoint, that's not the best way to work, because it means you're rendering a file and then rendering from that render again. And the pre-rendered files aren't that high quality to begin with, so you would only be doing this to save time and not to do it for a quality reason. So keep that in mind. I mean, if you are needing to export something out quickly and you've done a whole lot of pre-rendering in your timeline already, this will speed it up. But if you're wanting any sort of quality in the final export, or you're wanting to make sure you've got the best quality file possible, then make sure this is deselected and do the full render from the original footage on the timeline. Now, frame blending is for if you have frame blending applied to any of your clips on the timeline. So let me go in and quickly explain that for you. So if I had a section of footage here and I was changing its duration, let's say I wanted to run it back at 50% speed. Now when I play that back, you can see that it looks a bit stuttery, of course, because we're playing it at half speed. But what frame blend will do is it will blend all the in-between frames. So you can see that we've actually got two frames going on at once here. So when we play it back, it helps that feel just a little bit more smoother than it originally did. So frame blending in your export dialog box basically tells Premiere whether or not to actually use the frame blending that you've selected. So if you do have frame blending applied to some of your clips in your timeline, and you want that to appear on your export, then make sure that use frame blending is selected, which can help keep a smoother look even with footage that's a bit jarry and has been slowed down in not necessarily the best way. Or on the other hand, if you do have frame blending applied in your clip, but you don't want it to for the export for whatever reason, then you can leave that deselected. The metadata box is for if you're wanting to add extra metadata in. Honestly, I don't use this basically at all. And for the people that do use it, I'm sure you'll know how to use it without going through an overview tutorial like this. So I'll leave that for now. The Q button will send your export to Adobe Media Encoder instead of rendering it out with Premiere Pro. And exporting within Premiere Pro, instead of bouncing it out to Adobe Media Encoder, will just pop up a straight dialog box and start encoding straight out. So let me show you what it looks like when we export out to Adobe Media Encoder. Let me just drag these out. You can see that I was on sequence in and out then, and me dragging these out automatically changes it to custom, just as a little quick tip for you. So if we hit the Q button, Premiere is now sending that footage across to Adobe Media Encoder, and you can see that it's appeared in here. Now we can go in and change those settings that we've still made, and we get that exact same export settings dialog box up, and we can even look at the footage from Premiere. So this has dramatically improved over the last few years. The way this works, it's much more smoother and much more efficient than it used to be. So that's the way to get footage into Adobe Media Encoder, and it means that you can start exporting in the background and then still come across to Premiere and continue working away. Premiere is reasonably good as well at balancing the resources between Adobe Media Encoder and Premiere Pro. So what I mean by that is that if you have an export going in Adobe Media Encoder, but you still need to work within Adobe Premiere Pro, Adobe Media Encoder will hand over CPU resources to Premiere while it's needing to actually be used in Premiere. And then as soon as you stop using them in Premiere, Adobe Media Encoder will take them back and continue rendering as fast as it can. So it means you really can get a decent amount of multitasking out of the two, because you can keep that rendering in the background while you're still working in the foreground. So that pretty much covers this tutorial, I think. You do also have a whole lot of presets within Adobe Media Encoder that are very similar, if not identical, to the ones in Premiere Pro. So you can bring them across and add them to items you're using in Adobe Media Encoder. But for now, that should cover us, I think, and hopefully this tutorial's been useful to you and you've got something out of it. Thanks! Oh, and now there's one more thing that I realized I forgot to mention to you guys. I also built a what I've called a resolution/aspect ratio cheat sheet. So what it goes through is just all the different resolutions that you need to have if you're targeting different aspect ratios. So that may sound a little broad, but the sheet itself is a little broad. So basically the idea is to help you guys that aren't sure what resolution you need to be exporting out to. If you know you're needing to export out at 1080p, and you know it needs to be 16:9, then 1920 by 1080 is the export format you're needing to go to. So I've done that all the way down from SD, both for NTSC and PAL, standard definitions, all the way up through to 5K imagery and also Cinema DCP specs as well. Now the ones that I've got marked in green are commonly used formats. Definitely some are more common than others, so don't take them that they're all super common. But it should help you quickly identify the default kind of standards that are getting exported out to. So 720 by 576 in PAL land is very common. Similarly, 720 by 480 is very common in NTSC. 1280 by 720 is extremely common. It's the default 720p standard because it's 16:9, and 1080p being 1920 by 1080 is the default standard there as well. So I'll provide a link for that at the bottom of the video, and hopefully that'll be of use to some of you guys. Give me a shout at brad@unravel.com.au if you notice any problems or any of the things a bit off when you're calculating them out and trying to use them, and I'll get that updated and put a new sheet up there if it needs to be put up. But hopefully that's of use to you guys. Thanks again. Bye.